On May 10, 1945, at precisely 11:14 a.m., First Lieutenant Robert Klingman reached an altitude of 38,000 feet above Okinawa. That figure alone defied belief. His aircraft, the F-4U Corsair, was already 3,000 feet beyond its rated service ceiling, in an atmosphere so thin that flight itself was barely possible. At the limits of his machine, his own endurance, and the boundaries of known aerial combat tactics, Klingman had one objective: stop the Japanese Kawasaki Ki 45 Nick reconnaissance aircraft before it transmitted fleet positions that would enable another deadly wave of kamikaze strikes. In the past week alone, kamikaze pilots had sunk a dozen American ships. These suicide attacks, launched with grim resolve, were guided by photographic intelligence. The Nick aircraft, with its long-range cameras and high-altitude performance, made 2 full passes each day over the American fleet. It flew too high for interceptors to reach in time. Anti-aircraft guns couldn't touch it. Each photograph it transmitted meant more precision-targeted kamikazes, more burning ships, more dead sailors. Klingman was 28 years old and had flown 43 combat missions in just over a month. On the morning of May 10th, he was part of a 4-aircraft combat air patrol launched from Kadena Airfield at 9:40 a.m. Captain Kenneth Royer led the formation, which also included Captain Jim Cox and Second Lieutenant Frank Watson. They expected a routine patrol. At 10:37 a.m., ground radar reported a bogey at 25,000 feet, moving south directly toward the fleet. It was a Nick. Royer immediately ordered a climb to intercept. He instructed the pilots to drop their belly tanks and fire off ammunition to lighten their aircraft for the demanding ascent. Klingman emptied 2,000 rounds into the ocean, 687 pounds of weight gone in 30 seconds. The Corsairs, stripped and lean, clawed their way higher. At 20,000 feet, the first limits revealed themselves. Cox and Watson reported engine trouble. The thin air stressed the supercharged Pratt & Whitney R2800 engines beyond normal parameters. Royer ordered them to return to patrol altitude. The climb would continue with just 2 Corsairs, Royer and Klingman. At 36,000 feet, the outer edge of the Corsair's design, they were still climbing. Engines overheated. Control surfaces responded sluggishly. A stall meant death. But the Nick, still above them, was on its return leg. It had completed its second pass over the fleet. This was the last chance to stop it. Both Corsairs pushed beyond their limits. At 38,000 feet, Klingman and Royer finally closed the gap. Royer reached firing range first and unleashed his final rounds into the Nick's right engine. Flames erupted, but the aircraft held altitude on a single power plant. Klingman moved into position. The Nick's rear gunner opened fire. Bullets struck Klingman's right wing. He ignored the damage and pulled the trigger. Nothing. Again, nothing. His guns had frozen in the sub-zero temperatures. The weapons were useless. Only one option remained. With no ammunition and no time to lose, Klingman made his decision. He advanced the throttle, climbed above the Nick, and radioed Royer, "I'm going to ram him." But not by collision. He would use his 4-blade propeller as a weapon, aiming to cut into the Nick's tail section and bring it down without destroying his own aircraft. At full throttle, he dove. The rear gunner fired wildly. More bullets ripped into his wing. Klingman held steady. 20 feet, 15, 10. The propeller blades closed the distance. At roughly 300 miles per hour, metal struck metal. The blades bit into the Nick's rudder. The aircraft shuddered from the impact, but it remained airborne. Klingman pulled up for a second pass. His Corsair shook violently. The damaged propeller created a destructive imbalance. The vibration spread through the entire airframe. The engine temperature redlined. Every second risked total failure. He dove again, this time aiming for the rear cockpit. The gunner fired at Royer. Klingman struck. The blades sheared through the rear canopy. The machine gun mount broke loose. The gunner and his weapon were gone in an instant, flung into the slipstream at 300 miles per hour. Still, the Nick flew. With 2 blades now visibly damaged, Klingman prepared for a third and final dive. He came from above, the only angle that would allow him to strike the structural base of the tail. The Nix pilot tried evasive action, but it was too late. Klingman's propeller tore through the tail assembly. The entire rear section detached. The Nick entered a flat spin and disintegrated on its way down. No parachutes appeared. The reconnaissance photographs sank with the crew into the Pacific. But Klingman's own Corsair was nearly lost. The third strike had destroyed the propeller. One blade was missing 6 inches. Another was bent backward. The engine, pushed beyond all limits, now began to fail. Oil pressure dropped. Black smoke spilled from the cowling. The vibration was catastrophic. At 38,000 feet, Klingman initiated an emergency glide. He cut power. The propeller stopped. The vibration lessened. Slowly, using careful rudder input, he stabilized the aircraft. With a dead engine, frozen controls, and no fuel reserves, he turned south toward Kadena, 70 miles away. Royer formed up beside him. Neither spoke. Both knew the odds. At 20,000 feet, Klingman calculated his glide ratio. Every foot of altitude was precious. He needed 1,000 feet above the airfield to have a chance at a controlled approach. At 10,000 feet, he could see Okinawa. Kadena's runway appeared. A gray line stretched across the coastline. At 5,000 feet, the engine died entirely. The cockpit fell silent except for the rush of air over wings. The landing gear came down manually, 2 green lights, 1 red. The left main gear was stuck. If it failed on touchdown, the Corsair would cartwheel. At 1,000 feet, he was high. He slipped the aircraft sideways to lose altitude. At 20 feet, he flared gently. The right gear and nose gear touched down. The left held. The Corsair rolled to a stop with 300 feet of runway remaining. Total silence. Ground crews swarmed the aircraft. The propeller was wrecked. Oil coated the engine. Bullet holes riddled the wing. The Corsair was declared a total loss. Navy intelligence officers debriefed Klingman immediately. He described the failed guns, the 3 ramming passes, the separation of the Nix tail, and the absence of parachutes. Royer confirmed the kill. 1 Japanese reconnaissance aircraft destroyed. The mission was a success. The enemy received no intelligence. Kamikaze strikes based on that flight never happened. 2 days later, Klingman experienced hydraulic failure on a routine patrol. He bailed out at 5,000 feet. A destroyer picked him up after 30 minutes in the water. He returned to base and flew again the next day. Klingman's story did not end there. He was born on January 12, 1917, in Binger, Oklahoma. One of 9 children, he grew up during the Great Depression. At 17, he joined the Marines and served 4 years in Washington, D.C. as a ceremonial drummer. After a short time as a civilian, he enlisted in the Navy in 1940, becoming an aircraft mechanic aboard the USS Tennessee. He narrowly missed the attack on Pearl Harbor while undergoing carrier training in San Diego. By 1943, he was selected for aviation cadet training and commissioned as a Marine officer. He flew F-4U Corsairs with Marine Fighter Squadron 312 and deployed to Okinawa in April 1945. By the time of Japan's surrender in August, he had completed 78 combat missions and was awarded the Navy Cross for his actions on May 10th. He continued his service through the Korean War, deploying as a forward air controller with the 1st Marine Division. He directed airstrikes, saved countless lives, and earned another Air Medal. Over the next decade, he trained new pilots, passed on lessons from Okinawa, and rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel before retiring in 1966 after 32 years of service. Klingman rarely spoke about the May 10th mission, but the records tell the story. A pilot who climbed 3 miles past the sky his aircraft was meant to reach, a warrior who fought with nothing left but raw ingenuity, a man who turned his propeller into a sword and lived to tell the tale. He died on July 6, 2004 in Kihei, Hawaii. He was 87 years old. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. His headstone reads, Navy Cross, Distinguished Flying Cross, Air Medal. No other pilot in World War II brought down an enemy aircraft with a frozen gun and a spinning propeller. No one else survived doing it 3 times in one mission. His courage saved lives. His story deserves to be remembered.